She satisfies every craving, every need, every hunger he didn't know he had. Alara has spent her whole life disappearing into the background, the kind of woman who refills goblets before they're empty and smooths tablecloths before anyone notices the wrinkle. She is invisible by design, forgettable by necessity, because the alternative, being seen, being known, is something she cannot afford, not with what she carries, not with what she hides. So when the annual Harvest Summit brings foreign rulers to her master's estate, and Alara is assigned to attend the fearsome Alpha King Seren during the week-long negotiations, she tells herself it will be simple: serve his meals, anticipate his preferences, remain unremarkable. She does not anticipate the afternoon heat. She does not anticipate the quiet balcony overlooking the western orchards, where she finds him reading alone, the book open on the arm of his chair, a half-eaten pear beside it. She does not anticipate the heaviness in her own limbs after 3 sleepless nights preparing for his arrival. She sets down the pitcher of chilled water, refills his glass, and steps back to wait. The sun is warm. The breeze carries the scent of late apples. He has not spoken to her once, not a single word in 2 days, and somehow this makes him safe. So when her knees soften and the world blurs at the edges, Alara does what she has never done in her entire, careful, invisible life. She stops fighting it and sits down on the stone floor beside his chair and closes her eyes. Just for a moment, she tells herself, just until the dizziness passes. She wakes to warmth, not the sun, something closer, something alive and steady beneath her cheek. She is not on the floor. She is curled against something solid and breathing, her head resting on a thigh that feels like oak wrapped in velvet. Fingers are in her hair. Slow, absent, the way someone strokes a cat while reading. The book is still open. He is still reading. And she is in the Alpha King's lap, drooling slightly on his trousers. She does not move, cannot move. Her body has betrayed her completely, and her mind is screaming at a pitch only dogs and mortals in extreme peril should be able to hear. "You needed that," he says without looking down. His voice is low and unhurried, a voice that has never had to repeat itself. His fingers continue their slow path through her hair. "You haven't slept since I arrived. I can smell exhaustion on you." Alara opens her mouth to apologize, to explain, to do anything except what she actually does, which is press her face harder into his leg and make a sound that is not a word. "Stay," he says simply, and she does. She stays, and everything unravels from there. Alara had been told 3 things about Alpha King Seren before his arrival. He did not tolerate noise, he did not tolerate lateness, and he had, according to the trembling steward who delivered these instructions, once made a man weep simply by entering a room and standing there. The 3rd one seemed excessive, but Alara had learned long ago not to question the stories that preceded powerful men. The stories were usually wrong in the details and right in the feeling. The feeling, in this case, was fear. Lord Ashmore's estate sat at the northern edge of the grain valleys, prosperous and sprawling, with more rooms than purpose. Every autumn, it hosted delegations from neighbouring territories to negotiate harvest trade, water rights, and the quiet political manoeuvring that kept the region from sliding into the kind of war nobody could afford. This year, King Seren had come in person. Nobody knew why. An Alpha King did not attend grain negotiations. That was what ministers were for, what advisors existed to handle. Kings showed up when they wanted something that couldn't be put on paper. The household staff had been in hysterics for a week. Alara had been promoted, if it could be called that, from general attendant to personal servant for the king's suite, because 3 other candidates had developed sudden illnesses. One had eloped with a farrier, and Alara was the only person left who could carry a tray without her hands shaking. "You'll do fine," Mrs. Calloway, the head housekeeper, had said in a tone that suggested fine was the minimum, and anything less would result in a fate worse than the work camps. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look him in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. Don't touch him. Don't crowd him. Don't breathe too loudly. He's an alpha, a true alpha, and they can smell everything. Your fear, your sweat, your feelings. So don't have any." Alara had nodded. She was exceptionally good at not having feelings. She had been practicing for 23 years. The first morning of his stay, she brought breakfast to his rooms at precisely the time requested. She knocked twice, waited, entered when she heard nothing, and found the suite empty. The bed had been slept in, barely. One side of the covers turned back, the pillow still holding the impression of his head. She set the tray on the table by the window, arranged everything with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and turned to leave. He was standing in the doorway. She had not heard him approach. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way of the stories, but in the way that mattered, the way that made a room feel smaller, the way that made the air heavier. Tall, broad through the shoulders and chest, dark-haired, with a face that could have been handsome if it ever moved. His eyes were the color of winter rivers, pale gray-blue, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her lungs forget their function. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Alara said. Her voice came out steady, which was a miracle of the highest order. She curtsied. It was a very good curtsy, practiced in front of her small mirror until her reflection stopped wincing. He said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked past her to the table. He sat. He ate. He did not speak. She waited by the door, hands clasped, eyes on the middle distance, and tried not to exist too loudly. When he was finished, he stood and left without a word. This continued for 2 days. Breakfast, silence. Lunch, silence. Afternoon refreshments, silence. He never acknowledged her, never spoke, never looked at her longer than that first assessing glance. By the second evening, Alara had developed a theory. He wasn't being rude. He was being kind. He could smell her fear, she was certain of it. She had caught the way his jaw tightened when she entered, the way his nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. He knew she was terrified, and rather than address it, rather than make her perform ease she didn't feel, he simply let her be invisible. It was the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in years. Which made what happened on the third afternoon significantly worse. She had not slept properly in 6 days, 3 before his arrival, spent preparing his rooms, pressing linens, polishing silver, learning his preferences from the advanced steward who had a list longer than Alara's arm. 3 since, because serving a king meant being available at all hours, and the anxiety of potential failure was a more effective stimulant than any tonic. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the world had acquired a soft, unreliable quality. Edges blurred, sounds arrived from slightly wrong directions. She was carrying the water pitcher to the western balcony, where she had learned he liked to read after the midday meetings, and her body was operating on memory rather than intention. She found him there, chair angled toward the orchards, book open, pear half-eaten. The scene was so quiet, so removed from the chaos of the negotiations happening below, that something in her chest loosened dangerously. She set down the pitcher, filled his glass, stepped back. The sun pressed against her shoulders like a warm hand. The breeze smelled of late fruit and cut grass and something deeper, richer, the scent of him, which she had been trying very hard not to catalogue, but which her traitorous senses had been filing away since day one. Cedar and dark honey, and something that reminded her of the heart of a fire, not the flames, but the deep red center where heat lives. Her vision swam. She felt her knees go soft, felt the gentle downward pull of a body that had simply reached the end of its capacity for staying upright. She sat, on the stone floor beside his chair, her back against the balustrade, the pitcher within arm's reach in case he needed more. Just for a moment. Just until the ground stopped tilting. She did not remember closing her eyes. She did not remember the transition from sitting to leaning, from leaning to resting, from resting to the warm dark of a sleep so deep it felt like falling into water. She certainly did not remember ending up in his lap. When she woke, the first thing she registered was the heartbeat, not hers, slower, deeper, the heavy, steady rhythm of something large and vital and completely at rest. The second thing she registered was the hand in her hair. Third, the thigh beneath her cheek. Fourth, the absolute, catastrophic reality of her situation. She was curled in the Alpha King's lap like a house cat. Her head was on his thigh. Her hand, traitorous thing, was resting on his knee. She had been here long enough that the position felt settled, natural, as if her body had been doing this for years, rather than what could only have been, she prayed, a few minutes. The hand in her hair did not stop moving. "You needed that," he said. His voice rumbled through her cheekbone, through the muscle of his thigh, into her skull. "You haven't slept since I arrived. I can smell exhaustion on you." Ilara's brain produced a response. Her mouth, disconnected from all higher function, pressed against his leg and made a sound like a broken bellows. "Stay," he said. She stayed, not because she chose to, but because her body had staged a complete and total mutiny against her mind. Her muscles had dissolved. Her bones had gone soft. She was liquid against him, warm and heavy and absolutely incapable of moving. His fingers continued through her hair, slow, rhythmic, the same absent motion he'd probably been making for however long she'd been asleep. He turned a page. She could hear the paper, could feel the small shift of his body as his other hand moved. He was still reading. He had sat there, let a servant collapse into his lap, and continued reading. Ilara wondered if it was possible to die of mortification while simultaneously feeling more rested than she had in her entire life. Eventually, an eternity later, she managed to sit up. Her face was the color of a sunset, she was sure of it. Every shade of red ever conceived by nature was currently represented on her cheeks. "Your Majesty," she started. "Seren," he said. She stared at him. His expression hadn't changed, still that impassive, carved-from-stone composure. But his eyes were different, warmer. The pale gray blue had thawed to something almost silver, and the way he was looking at her was not the way anyone had ever looked at her in her entire life. "I should go," Alara said. "You should eat something first," he replied. "When did you last eat?" She opened her mouth, closed it, tried to remember. The silence was apparently answer enough. He reached for the pear, the one he'd been eating, and held it out to her. "Eat. That is not a request." Alara took the pear. She bit into it. The juice ran down her chin, and she wiped it with the back of her hand, like a feral child. And the Alpha King of the Northern Territories watched her do it, with an expression that looked, impossibly, dangerously, like tenderness. She fled immediately after, but his scent stayed on her skin for hours, and when she finally climbed into her narrow bed in the servants' quarters that night, she pressed her face into her own hair and breathed in cedar and dark honey and the deep red center of a fire. She was in serious trouble. The next morning she brought his breakfast as usual, knocked twice, entered. He was at the table already, seated, waiting. A second plate had been laid, across from his. She stood in the doorway, tray in hand, and stared at the second plate like it was a live animal. "Sit down, Alara," he said. He knew her name. She had never told him her name. She sat. She had no idea why she sat. Every protocol she had ever been taught was screaming at her, but her legs were already moving, carrying her to the chair opposite the Alpha King, and she sat down with her tray still in her hands because she had forgotten what to do with it. He took it from her, set it aside, pushed the second plate toward her. "Eat." "Your Majesty, I cannot," she started.
Seren.
"Your eye the servants eat in the kitchens. You are not eating in the kitchens. You're eating here, with me." His eyes held hers. She counted. 1 second. 2. 3. She was supposed to look away after 3. She didn't. Neither did he. "Why?" she asked. The question came out before she could catch it, small and bewildered and much too honest. Something shifted in his expression. The composure cracked just a fraction, just enough for her to see something underneath, something raw and surprised and hungry, not for the food. "Because," he said slowly, as though the words were unfamiliar to him, "you are the first person in this entire estate who has not performed for me. You do not smile when you're not happy. You do not laugh when nothing is funny. You do not fill silence with noise. You simply exist, quietly and honestly, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about it." Alara's hand trembled on the edge of the table. "I'm not interesting. I'm a servant." "You fell asleep on me," he said, uninvited, unannounced, and without a shred of self-consciousness. "In 20 years of rule, no one has ever been that unguarded in my presence, not once." He paused. "Eat your breakfast, Alara, before it gets cold." She ate. The eggs were perfect. The bread was warm. She tasted none of it because the Alpha King was watching her eat with the focused attention of a man who had just discovered something he intended to keep. And Alara's heart was doing things that should have required medical attention. The days that followed were impossible. She still served him, still brought meals and refreshments, and ensured his rooms were maintained. But the silences between them had changed. They were no longer empty. They were full, weighted with the particular tension of two people who are constantly, acutely, almost painfully aware of each other. He began speaking to her, Small things at first. Comments about the negotiations, dry observations about the various lords and their transparent maneuvering. She discovered that Seren, beneath the terrifying exterior, was quietly, devastatingly funny. Not in the way that demanded laughter, but in the way that slipped a knife of wit into the most mundane observation and left it there for her to find. "Lord Ashmore," he said one afternoon, watching the portly lord cross the courtyard below the balcony, "has used the phrase, 'with all due respect,' 14 times today. I've been counting. He means none of it." Alara, who had been refilling his glass, snorted. It was not a dignified sound. It was not the sound of a proper servant. It was the sound of a woman who had been caught off guard by genuine amusement, and it burst out of her like a confession. Seren looked at her and smiled. She had never seen him smile before. It changed everything about his face. The severity dissolved, the hard angles softened, and for one unguarded moment, he looked like a man rather than a monument. Alara's heart did something violent. She excused herself immediately and went to the linen closet and stood there in the dark for 4 minutes, pressing her hands to her flaming cheeks and trying to remember how breathing worked. This was madness. He was a king. She was nobody. Less than nobody. She was a servant with no family name, no lineage, no education beyond what she'd taught herself from borrowed books and overheard conversations. She owned 2 dresses, one of which had a mend in the sleeve she hoped no one noticed. She could not even read properly, not the formal scripts used in court documents and treaties, only the simple letters she had learned from a cook's daughter when she was 12. Kings did not notice servants. Kings did not feed servants breakfast. Kings did not let servants fall asleep in their laps and then look at them like they were something precious. Except this one did. And Alara, who had spent her entire life being invisible, who had perfected the art of disappearing so thoroughly that she sometimes wondered if she existed at all, found herself wanting, desperately, terrifyingly, to be seen. Just by him. Only by him. The negotiations dragged on. What should have been a 4-day summit stretched into its 2nd week as Lord Ashmore and the various territorial delegates argued over water rights and grain allocations with the passionate tedium of men who enjoyed hearing themselves talk. Seren attended every session. Alara learned his moods from the set of his shoulders when he returned. Tight and high meant frustration. Loose meant progress. The rare occasions when they dropped entirely, when he entered his rooms with a particular heaviness, those meant something had reminded him of whatever weight he carried beneath the crown. She never asked. He never explained. But she started leaving small things. A pot of tea when the meetings ran late. A bowl of the honeyed almonds she'd noticed he favored. A book from Lord Ashmore's library that she thought he might enjoy. One about the migration patterns of northern birds, because she'd seen him watching the starlings from the balcony with the quiet attention of a man who wished he could follow them somewhere. He found the book and looked at her across the room with those winter river eyes, and Alara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You noticed that you watch the birds?" She tried to make it sound unremarkable. "You watch them every evening." "Nobody notices what I watch." The words were simple. The ache in them was not. That evening she was adjusting the fire in his sitting room when he spoke from the doorway behind her. "Tell me about yourself." Alara's hand stilled on the poker. "There isn't much to tell. Seren." His name felt dangerous in her mouth. Intimate, like a secret she wasn't supposed to have. "Tell me anyway." She straightened, set the poker down, turned to face him. He was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her with that focused intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. I've worked in service since I was 11. Before that, I lived with my grandmother in a village south of here. She died when I was 10. There was no other family. Mrs. Calloway took me on because I was small and quiet and could carry things without dropping them. She shrugged, a small movement that contained an ocean of things she would not say. That's the whole story. I doubt that. Something in his voice made her chest tighten. He could hear her heartbeat, she realized. Could probably smell the sadness she kept locked so far down she sometimes forgot it was there. "What about you?" she asked, because deflection was the only defense she had left. "What's the king's story?" "Equally brief," he said. "Inherited a throne I never wanted. Spent 10 years trying to be worthy of it. Came to a grain summit because my advisors said it would be unremarkable, and I was tired of being remarkable." He paused. Found something unexpected. The air between them contracted. "Theron," Alara said, and her voice came out wrong, too soft, too open, carrying all the things she was supposed to keep hidden. "You should go," he said abruptly. His jaw had tightened. His hands, crossed over his chest, had curled into fists. She could see the effort it cost him, the visible restraint. "If you stay, I am going to do something that cannot be undone." Alara left. She walked down the corridor to the servants' staircase and descended into the warren of rooms below, and each step felt like tearing cloth. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and pressed her hand over her heart and felt it beating his name. 3 days later, the estate held a feast. Lord Ashmore, eager to celebrate the progress of negotiations, had commissioned an elaborate dinner with musicians and dancing and enough wine to float a ship. The servants worked themselves raw. Alara was everywhere at once, carrying trays, directing the younger staff, ensuring the high table was properly arranged. She did not see Seren until the guests were seated and the first course was served. He was at the head of the table beside Lord Ashmore, wearing formal attire that made him look like he'd been carved from the night sky. Dark fabric, silver threading at the collar, his hair pushed back from his face. He looked magnificent and miserable. The daughter of a neighboring lord had been seated beside him, Lady Seren, beautiful, poised, educated, everything Alara was not. She watched from the shadows near the kitchen entrance as Lady Seren leaned close and said something that made the table laugh. Theron's mouth moved in what could generously be called a smile. It did not reach his eyes. Alara's stomach clenched. She turned away, busied herself with the bread baskets, and told herself firmly that it was fine. This was how it was supposed to work. Kings married ladies, servants served bread. The natural order of things did not rearrange itself because someone had fallen asleep in someone else's lap. "You." The voice behind her was sharp and unfamiliar. She turned. Lady Seren stood in the corridor, having apparently excused herself from the table. She was taller than Alara by half a head, willowy and elegant, with hair the color of burnished copper, and eyes that were currently dissecting Alara with surgical precision. "You're the one they assigned to his suite." It was not a question. "Yes, my lady." Lady Seren studied her for a long moment. "You know what you are, don't you?" Alara's hands tightened on the basket. "A servant, my lady." Precisely. Lady Seren's smile was thin and cool, and King Seren is a man of extraordinary discipline. Whatever you think is happening, whatever he has allowed you to believe, it is not what you imagine. The words landed like stones in still water. He is kind to those beneath him. It is one of his more admirable qualities. But kindness is not affection, and a king's attention is not an invitation. She tilted her head slightly. I say this as advice, not cruelty. Step back before you embarrass yourself and him. Ilara's throat was so tight she couldn't breathe. Thank you, my lady, for the advice. She curtsied and walked away before her face could betray her. In the pantry, behind the sacks of flour and the hanging herbs, she pressed her back against the wall and slid to the floor, and did not cry. She did not cry because she had learned long ago that crying changed nothing. It did not bring grandmothers back. It did not make invisible girls visible. It did not bridge the distance between a servant's quarters and a king's chambers. Lady Seren was right. She was nobody. She had been fooling herself, reading meaning into meals and silences and the weight of a hand in her hair. He was kind. That was all. That was everything and nothing, and she needed to stop wanting more. The next morning, she sent one of the younger maids to deliver the king's breakfast. She did not go to the balcony. She did not refill his glass. She removed herself with the same quiet efficiency with which she had always done everything, folding her presents away like linen, smooth and neat, and leaving no wrinkle. By midday, Mrs. Calloway found her in the laundry. Ilara, the housekeeper said, her face pinched with a particular expression that meant trouble of the highest order. The king has requested you specifically. I'm sure Maisie can manage his afternoon service. He doesn't want afternoon service. He wants you, specifically you, in his rooms, now. Her hands stilled. I can't. Ilara, this is the Alpha King. You cannot refuse a direct request. Tell him I'm unwell. Are you unwell? Yes. She wasn't. Mrs. Calloway gave her a look that could have curdled milk. Get yourself up those stairs and attend to the king before I find myself short a servant. That is not a suggestion. Ilara went. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, rebuilding the walls she had spent 5 days accidentally dismantling. By the time she reached his door, she was composed, invisible, unremarkable. She knocked twice. Come in. He was standing by the window, not sitting, not reading, just standing with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him, looking out at the orchards where she had first fallen asleep on him. You sent someone else this morning. Maisie is very capable. I didn't ask for capable. I asked for you. I thought it would be more appropriate to maintain professional distance, Your Majesty. The title was deliberate. She saw his shoulders tighten at it. What happened? He asked. He turned then, and the expression on his face undid every wall she'd built on the stairs. He looked hurt. Not angry, not commanding, just quietly, genuinely hurt. Like something precious had been taken from him while he wasn't looking. Lady Seren spoke to me last night. She reminded me of certain realities. A muscle in Theron's jaw ticked. What realities? That you are a king, that I am a servant, that kindness is not affection and attention is not an invitation. She delivered the words like a report, clean, clinical, dead. Theron was very still. She said that. She was correct. She was not correct. She was wrong about every single thing she said to you, and I will be speaking with her about the presumption of telling someone in my household how to interpret my own behavior. Theron, please. His name slipped out before she could stop it. Don't make this harder. I know what I am. I know what you are. There is no version of this that ends well for someone like me. Someone like you. What does that mean? It means I own 2 dresses. It means I can barely read. It means I don't know which fork to use at formal dinners, and I couldn't name 3 territories on a map, and I have never in my life been anything to anyone, and I cannot survive being something to you and then going back to being nothing. Her voice broke on the last word. Small, devastating, a crack running through stone. Then he crossed the room. 3 strides, maybe 4. She didn't count because he was suddenly there, right there, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like arms, and his hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. You are the only real thing I have found in 10 years of ruling a kingdom that runs on pretense. You are honest and brave, and you notice things that no one else sees. You left me a book about birds because you saw me watching starlings, and that single act of attention has meant more to me than anything anyone has done since I took the throne. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. I don't care about forks. I don't care about dresses. I don't care if you can't read court scripts. I care that you exist, and that you fell asleep on me because you felt safe enough to stop pretending. I fell asleep on you because I was exhausted, Alara said weakly. And you chose my lap. Out of all the surfaces available on that balcony, you chose me. She had no counter for this. He was right. Her unconscious body had bypassed the stone bench, the floor, the perfectly good wall, and crawled directly into the lap of the most powerful man on the continent. What this said about her survival instincts was deeply concerning. What it said about everything else was undeniable. This can't work. I have been told that most things I've accomplished can't work. I find the phrase unconvincing. He didn't kiss her. She wanted him to, wanted it so badly her hands were shaking, but he didn't. He just stood there, holding her face like it was made of something breakable, and looked at her with those winter river eyes that had thawed completely into silver. Stay, not as a servant. Stay because you want to, because I am asking you to. Because this thing between us is worth discovering. Alara closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek and over his thumb, and he caught it, held it. And she thought that this was what it felt like to be seen, not glanced at, not assessed. Seen. All the way down to the small, scared, wanting center of herself. I'll stay, she said. The remaining days of the summit passed in a haze of stolen moments and careful renegotiation, not of grain rights, but of everything Alara thought she understood about her own life. Seren did not parade her before the court. He did not make declarations. What he did was quieter, more devastating. He rearranged the architecture of her days so that she was always near him, not serving, but present. She sat with him during his morning review of correspondence. She walked with him in the orchards in the late afternoon, and he told her about his territory, the mountains and the pine forests, and the wolves that sang at dusk. And she told him about her grandmother's garden, and the way lavender smelled in rain, and the book she'd been trying to read for 3 years, sounding out words she didn't know, one painful syllable at a time. "I'll teach you," he said, not with pity, with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he said everything, like her inability to read was simply a problem to be solved, not a mark against her worth. "You're a king. You don't have time to teach a servant to read. You're not a servant, and I will make time." He did. That evening, in his sitting room, with the fire burning low and the estate quiet around them, he sat beside her on the settee and opened a book across both their laps and began pointing to words. His patience was extraordinary. He never corrected her with frustration. When she stumbled, he simply repeated the word and waited. When she got one right, his mouth curved into that rare, devastating smile that she was becoming increasingly addicted to. "You're a good teacher. You're a better student than you think." She looked up at him and found him already looking at her. The book was forgotten between them. His hand came up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw as they withdrew. The touch was light, careful, restrained, but his eyes were not restrained. His eyes were a storm. "Alara," he said, and her name in his mouth was a new word entirely, one she was only just learning to read. She kissed him. She didn't decide to. It was more like falling, that same helpless gravity that had pulled her into his lap on the balcony. Her hand came up to the collar of his shirt, her fingers curling into the fabric, and she pulled herself toward him and pressed her mouth to his. He went completely still. For one terrible heartbeat, she thought she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then his hand slid into her hair, and his other arm wrapped around her waist, and he pulled her against him and kissed her back, with 10 years of loneliness compressed into a single point of contact. He kissed her like she was water, and he'd been crossing a desert. Thorough, desperate, reverent. His mouth moved against hers with a controlled intensity that made her dizzy, and when she opened to him, when she made a small sound against his lips that she would later pretend she hadn't made, his grip tightened and something in him shifted, went deeper, went to a place she could feel in her own chest like a second heartbeat. He pulled back just enough to breathe. His forehead rested against hers. "I should warn you, I am not going to be able to let you go after this." "Good, because I have nowhere else I want to be." He kissed her again, and the book slid off their laps, and neither of them noticed. Then Lady Seren held a gathering. It was small, exclusive, the kind of intimate evening event that was really a stage for political performance. Alara would not have been there at all, except that Seren had asked her to attend as his companion, which had sent Lord Ashmore into a diplomatic spiral, and Mrs. Calloway into a state of shock so profound she'd had to sit down with a glass of cooking sherry. Alara wore her better dress, the one without the mend in the sleeve. One of the younger maids had helped her with her hair. She looked, she thought, like a servant wearing her better dress with her hair done, which was exactly what she was. The other guests looked at her the way one looks at a stain on good fabric. Curiosity, distaste, and the particular kind of fascination reserved for things that are clearly out of place. Lady Seren was radiant in deep blue silk, greeting guests with practiced grace. When her eyes found Alara, something cold and sharp moved through her expression. She covered it quickly. How charming! The king's little project. He does love his causes. The laughter was quiet, refined, utterly devastating. Alara felt it land in her chest like a fist. She smiled, said nothing. The smile cost her everything. Seren appeared at her side, a hand at the small of her back, warm and solid and sure. He had heard. She knew he had heard, because the temperature of his skin had risen, and his jaw was set in a way that promised consequences. "Don't," Alara murmured. "She's not wrong." She is wrong, about everything except the charming part. Despite herself, Alara felt her mouth curve. The evening proceeded. Alara sat beside Theron and tried to follow the conversation, which wound through trade alliances and territorial disputes, and the names of people she didn't know in places she'd never been. She understood perhaps a third of it. She understood enough to know when Theron was being deliberately provoked, when Lord Ashmore was deflecting, when the delegate from the eastern valleys was lying about his crop yields. She leaned close during a lull. The eastern delegate. He keeps touching his ear when he gives numbers. Theron's eyes flicked to her, then to the delegate, then back. You noticed that. He's done it 4 times. His reported yields don't match the quality of his delegation's clothing. They're too well dressed for a territory claiming poor harvests. The look Theron gave her was indescribable. It contained surprise and admiration, and something fiercer, something possessive and proud. You should have been an advisor. I can't even read properly. Reading can be taught in months. What you just did takes a lifetime to learn. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first day on the balcony, like she was something extraordinary he'd found by accident and intended to keep. Come home with me. When the summit ends, come back to my territory, not as a servant, not as a project, not as anything you don't want to be. Just come. Her breath caught. The court will never accept me. The court will accept what I tell them to accept. That isn't how it works. It is exactly how it works when you are the king. Theron, say yes. People will talk. They'll say I've bewitched you, that I'm scheming, that I'm Alara. What? Say yes. She looked into his eyes, those winter eyes gone completely silver with want and hope, and the terrifying vulnerability of a man who had everything except the one thing he was asking for. Yes, she said. She should have known it couldn't be that simple. The morning after the gathering, Mrs. Calloway summoned her to the housekeeper's office. Lord Ashmore was there, and Lady Seren, and a man Alara didn't recognize, tall and official-looking, wearing the insignia of the Alpha King's household guard. Sit down, Alara, Lord Ashmore said. She sat. Her hands were steady in her lap. Her heart was not. It has come to our attention, Lord Ashmore began, and the careful neutrality of his tone told Alara everything she needed to know about what was coming, that your relationship with King Seren has become inappropriate. Inappropriate, Alara repeated. You are a household servant. Whatever the king has led you to believe, his advisors and counsel will not permit a formal attachment to someone of your station. Surely you understand that. I understand what you're telling me. I'm asking whether the king shares this view. The official-looking man spoke for the first time. His Majesty's personal wishes are not the only consideration. The stability of the Northern Territories depends on strategic alliances, which are secured through marriage to appropriate partners. An attachment to a common servant, however, he paused, charming, would undermine years of diplomatic work. The word charming landed like a slap. Lady Seren's word from the gathering, recycled, weaponized. We're not asking you to end things dramatically, simply to step back, to allow the king to return to his duties without the complication of a Well, a complication, Alara supplied. I believe Lord Ashmore means a distraction. You could remain in service here. Your position would be secure, or, if you prefer, arrangements could be made for you elsewhere. A generous severance, enough to establish yourself in a new village. A fresh start. They were offering her money. To leave. To disappear. To become invisible again, which she'd always been so good at. Alara looked at her hands in her lap, thought about Theron's hand in her hair on the balcony, thought about his voice saying, "Stay," thought about the book on their laps, and the patience in his teaching, and the way he'd kissed her like she was the answer to a decade of loneliness. No. Lady Seren's composure cracked. Excuse me? No, I won't step back. I won't take your money, and I won't disappear because my existence is inconvenient for your plans. She stood, her chair scraped against the floor. If the king wishes me to go, he can tell me himself, but I will not be managed by people who have never once asked either of us what we want. She walked out. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. But she walked out with her spine straight and her chin level, and she did not look back. She was halfway up the main staircase when the shaking caught up with her. She grabbed the banister, pressed her forehead against the cool wood, and tried to breathe. What had she done? She'd just defied Lord Ashmore in his own estate, defied Lady Seren, who had the kind of connections that could make a servant's life genuinely dangerous, defied the king's own household guard representative. For what? For a man she'd known for 12 days who would return to his territory and his crown and his duties and eventually, inevitably, marry someone appropriate, someone who could read and navigate court and represent a kingdom without using the wrong fork. Alara. She looked up. Theron was at the top of the stairs. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and she could see in his eyes that he already knew. That someone had already told him, or that he'd heard, or that he'd simply sensed it the way he seemed to sense everything about her. They told you. They told me you refused their offer and walked out. Something fierce and bright moved through his expression. Yes, well, I was not interested in being managed. He descended to her step, took her face in his hands, looked at her with those storm-silver eyes. I'm not going to let them send you away. I know. I'm not going to let anyone send you away. Not Ashmore, not Seren, not my council, not the entire assembled aristocracy of the continent. I know that, too. Then why are you shaking? She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Because I have never in my life stood up for myself before, and it turns out it's terrifying. He pulled her against his chest, held her there on the staircase where anyone could see, where servants passed with linens and guards stood at attention, and the entire estate could witness the Alpha King of the Northern Territories holding a maid against his heart like she was the most valuable thing in the world. You were magnificent. I was shaking the entire time. That's what makes it magnificent. She pressed her face against his chest and breathed in cedar and dark honey and fire. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, the same rhythm she'd woken to on the balcony, the rhythm she was beginning to think she'd been listening for her entire life without knowing it. Take me home. The words were muffled against his shirt, barely audible. He heard them. When? Now, today, before I lose my nerve. His arms tightened around her. You don't need nerve. You have me. Same thing, Ilara said, and felt him smile against the top of her head. 3 months later, Ilara sat in a window seat in the king's private library, a book open on her lap. She was reading, actually reading, following the words across the page with increasing confidence, sounding out the difficult ones under her breath. The library was warm, filled with late afternoon light and the scent of old paper and the fire crackling in the hearth. Through the tall windows, she could see the mountains that ringed Theron's territory, snow-capped and ancient, and below them the dark sweep of pine forest where wolves sang at dusk. She could hear them sometimes from their chambers, those long, aching calls that rose and fell like music. The first time she'd heard them, she'd pressed her hand to her chest and felt something stir beneath her ribs, something warm and wild that she was only beginning to understand. Court had been exactly as difficult as everyone warned her it would be. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the nobles who couldn't quite bring themselves to address her directly, who spoke over her head or around her or through Theron, as though she were a piece of furniture he'd inexplicably brought to dinner. Lady Seren had followed them north, attached to a diplomatic envoy that was transparently an excuse to maintain her proximity to the king. She attended every function with her practiced smile and her cutting observations. And Ilara endured it, because endurance was something she had been practicing her entire life. But she was also learning. Theron's senior advisor, a gruff, pragmatic woman named Chancellor Seren, who had served 3 kings and feared none of them, had taken one look at Ilara's desperate expression during her first state dinner and said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning. We have work to do." The work was relentless. Protocol, history, territorial law, the names and alliances of every noble house in the region. Ilara absorbed it with the same fierce, quiet determination with which she had taught herself to read, one painstaking piece at a time. She stumbled constantly, mispronounced names, used the wrong titles. Once, memorably, addressed the ambassador from the Western Territories as "my lord," when the ambassador was, in fact, a woman in formal military dress. The ambassador had laughed. Chancellor Seren had not. But Ilara kept going. She kept going because giving up would prove every whisper right, and because Theron believed in her with a certainty that felt like bedrock, and because somewhere beneath the terror and the self-doubt, she had discovered something startling. She was good at this. Not at the performance, not at the curtsies and the small talk and the delicate dance of courtly etiquette. She was terrible at those things, and might always be. But she was good at seeing, good at noticing the things that slid past other people's attention. The delegate who touched his ear, the advisor whose smile never reached his eyes, the alliance that looked solid on paper but sat wrong in a room. "You have an extraordinary instinct for people," Chancellor Seren told her one evening. "An instinct that cannot be taught, and that most nobles spend their entire lives failing to develop." "Is that enough to make up for everything I don't know?" Chancellor Seren had given her a look. "Child, half the nobles in this territory can recite their genealogies back 12 generations, and couldn't tell you what their own servants think of them. Knowledge without perception is decoration. You have the thing that matters." She paused. "Now learn the rest, quickly." Ilara was still reading when the door opened. She looked up. Theron stood in the doorway, crown absent, collar loosened, looking tired and beautiful and, she noted with the observational skill she was increasingly proud of, lighter than he had that morning. "Good meeting?" The Eastern Territories agreed to the trade revision. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the window seat, his thigh pressing against hers. Your observation about their delegates' behavior was instrumental, by the way. We caught the crop yield discrepancy. They were over-reporting by 30%. I'm glad. The Council has formally approved the allocation changes. Then, quietly, Maeve also stopped questioning your presence at advisory sessions. Alara's hand stilled on the page. They have? Chancellor Seren informed them that your analytical contributions have been more valuable than half the advisory staff. He paused. She used the word indispensable. I believe Lord Seren fainted. Alara laughed. The sound surprised her every time, still. 6 months ago, she hadn't known how to laugh in front of another person without covering her mouth. Come here, Seren said. She shifted closer. He took the book from her lap, set it aside, and pulled her against him. She settled into the curve of his body with the ease of long practice, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. You're reading Meren's treatise on territorial governance. Is it any good? It's dense, but I'm on chapter 4. Only had to look up 11 words. Down from 23 in chapter 1. You've been counting. I notice everything about you. You know that. She tilted her head up to look at him. His face was soft in the firelight, the severity gone, the guard down. This was the version of him that no one else saw, the one that existed only here, in the quiet spaces between duties, in the library with the wolves singing outside and the fire burning low. I spoke to the council today about a formal announcement. Her heart rate spiked. He would have felt it, could probably feel it now through the bond that had been growing between them, that invisible thread she sometimes swore she could actually sense, a warmth in her chest that pulled her toward him like gravity. An announcement, she repeated carefully. A betrothal, if you'll have me. She sat up, looked at him properly. He was watching her with that same expression from the staircase, the one that contained everything fierce and vulnerable about a man who had walked into a grain summit looking for nothing and found the whole of his life sitting on the floor beside his chair. You're sure? Not a question, really. More a statement she needed to hear him confirm. Alara. He took her hand, pressed it to his chest. I have been sure since you fell asleep on me, possibly before that. Possibly since you walked into my rooms on the first morning, and your heartbeat was so fast I thought you might actually die of fear. And you still curtsied perfectly, and set down the tray without spilling a single thing. And I thought, this woman is the bravest person I have ever met. I was terrified, she admitted. I know. That's why it was brave. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the bridge of her nose, the corner of her mouth. Each kiss deliberate, precise, a cartographer mapping territory he intended to keep. Say yes. Yes, Alara said. He kissed her properly then, deep and thorough and unhurried, his hands in her hair, her hands fisted in his shirt. And outside the wolves began to sing, and the sound rose through the window and wrapped around them like a benediction. Later, much later, when the fire had burned to embers, and they lay tangled together on the library settee, warm and drowsy and entirely unwilling to move, Alara pressed her face against his throat and whispered something she had been carrying for months. I love you. The words were small and certain, and they tasted like coming home. I know, he said. I've known since the balcony. You have not, Your heartbeat told me. Your scent told me. Every single thing about you told me, Alara. You are the most transparent person I have ever met, and I love every visible inch of you. She hit him lightly on the chest. He caught her hand, kissed her palm, held it against his heart. I love you. Stay. Always, she said. She meant it. She had spent 23 years learning to disappear. She intended to spend the rest of her life learning to stay. 18 months later, on a cool autumn morning, Queen Alara sat in the same window seat, in the same library, a different book on her lap. She was reading aloud this time, slowly and carefully, because the person she was reading to could not yet read for himself. He was very small. He had his father's dark hair and her brown eyes, and a grip on her finger that suggested he had inherited the stubbornness of both parents. Theron leaned in the doorway, watching them with an expression that no one in his court would have recognized, an expression of such open, unguarded joy that it transformed his entire face. You're reading him trade policy, starting him early. Chancellor Marin says it's never too soon. Theron crossed the room, sat beside them. Their son released Alara's finger and immediately reached for his father's considerably larger one. Theron offered it solemnly. The baby gripped it with fierce determination. Strong, like his mother. His mother once fell asleep on a stranger's lap because she forgot to eat for 3 days. His mother was brave enough to sit down. Everything else followed from that. Alara leaned against him. Their son made a sound of contentment between them, small and sure. Through the window, the mountains stood sentinel, and the pine forest stretched dark and endless, and somewhere in the deep woods, the wolves began to sing. She closed her eyes and listened, and stayed. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you very soon with the next story. Please subscribe.